In this video, I'll be discussing the two justice bills that I talked about in my prior video, and I'll be discussing the details on them and my thoughts. Hope you guys enjoy. Reading through both bills, there is a decent amount of overlap. There is differences in language, but I'll start with what they have in common. And the first is officer training. This is low-hanging fruit because that's the easiest thing that everyone agrees on, that police officers need more training. And if you just do a quick Google search of a police academy, it's about 5 months. And when you look up a barbershop, it's about 10 months. Now, I get it. It's not a great apples to apple comparison. And some police departments do require associate's degrees. But I did look into that also. And a 2013 study by the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that only 1/4 of all police departments require a minimum of an associate's degree. Fast forward to 2020, I would assume it's still under 1/2 of all police departments. So one thing that the bill intends to do is create independent credentialed sites that are credentialed by the Justice Department that will offer things like de-escalation training, behavioral crisis training, and a duty to intervene training. Now, I like that last one because think about how many videos you've seen of officers that use excessive force and a fellow officer is just looking at them or just standing by and not really intervening, not saying, hey, buddy, cool off. I'll take this one. This training, I don't know how much is going to change in terms of the warrior culture or just a culture in the police department. I hope that it's enough. Now, both bills don't say specifically that police academies are going to be X amount of time from this amount of time, or that they're going to be required to undergo this training on a yearly basis. Now, the Justice and Policing Bill passed by the Democrats did have a section 113 under the Uniformity of Accreditation Standards, which has a section on training that might require that uniformity of, hey, all police academies or all police departments need to have X amount of training a year under this uniform standard. I'm not sure how strong that legal language is in that bill, but overall, from what I've seen on both bills, it's not a continuing thing. So my fear with training in these bills is that we're going to have credentialed sites, we're going to have these training facilities, but are departments really going to be expected to continually use them to train their officers? Because I personally think that it needs to be a part of an officer's career that they're trained on an ongoing basis. And you can see this for lots of other professional fields, especially my field of PT, where you need to have a certain amount of credits on a yearly basis to keep up with your practicing license. Next, both bills are similar in that they really get on the issue of body cameras. And both justice bills, they require it of every uniformed police officer. And federal funding will ensure that departments do acquire them, and non-compliance will result in overall departmental reduction in funding. So that's an incentive to make sure that every police department does require body cameras of their officers. And there are also some procedures in place that make sure that they're used appropriately and there are no accidents. The Democratic bill does take it a step further in that they do require cameras on police federal vehicles. And I don't see that in Scott's bill. So that's just one step up that the Democratic bill did do. The third agreement is a police registry for officer misconduct. Now, the registry will be shared and available to all local and state departments, and departments will be required to background check officers before hiring them. And that's a good step. Now, exactly what misconduct is and what can be reported in the registry differs in the Republican bill from the Democratic bill. In Scott's Republican bill, only police officer misconduct that is substantiated is reported. In contrast, the Democratic bill would save records on a lot more. They mandate reporting requirements for any use of force incident that includes a police shooting, a death under police custody, all arrests and bookings. So pretty much a lot more data to track. And I'm in agreement with this because if you've been living in the 21st century, you know that the more data you have, the better. So the hope is that officers with a long list of misconduct, that departments can look at them and say who the bad actors are, who needs more training. And if they are fired, that they just can't hop from another department to another department, because there's now a nationwide database that's shared with the FBI that can let recruiting officers know that this officer has over a dozen complaints against them, or misconducts that this is all adding up, and this guy's going to be a liability, and we're not going to hire him because he's not a tempered cop. So the hope is that this bill incentivizes officers to keep their records clean. Both bills also have restrictions on no knock warrants in honor of Breonna Taylor, and also restrictions on chokeholds. Now, they do so with different language. I've read that the Democratic bill goes a little bit further in terms of legal language that really restrict it a little bit more heavily. Now, I don't think it's worth getting into here, but just know that no knock warrants in honor of Breonna Taylor and chokeholds in honor of Eric Gardner and George Floyd, videos that we all might have seen or heard about. Both bills also make lynching a federal hate crime. Now, I actually was a little bit surprised by this because I would have thought that this was passed by the Senate a long time ago. Lynching is a horrible crime, and I suppose after 100 years of unsuccessful efforts by the Senate, as is mentioned on Scott's bill, that this will definitely pass when a final police reform bill is negotiated eventually. Both bills also attempt to change the culture of law enforcement. This one's a little bit mixed because both bills try to do so differently. The Republican bill makes mention of a national curriculum that educates officers on the history of racism and also creates two commissions, one the National Criminal Justice Commission Act and the other a commission on the social status of Black men and boys act. I imagine one's going to look into the criminal justice system and see what changes need to be done to help alleviate the systemic racism that's prevalent in the criminal justice system that tends to incarcerate minorities, especially Black men and boys. And the second commission, I think, is going to kind of go more in detail into how to lift Black men and children from poverty. Now, on the flip side, the Democratic bill creates a task force on law enforcement oversight. And oversight takes the form of one section in this bill that calls for independent agency or civilian review board that investigates use of deadly force by police officers. I think independent investigations are important things because complaints against officers undergo internal affairs, and usually internal affairs are within police departments. And what happens is that officers, when there's complaints against them and their complaints go through internal affairs, which is within the police department, it tends to be very charitable towards officers. And many activists have seen this as policing themselves. I think Newark, New Jersey has already attempted to do this, and police unions have sued against it, saying it's not legal. So I hope that this bill does pass that piece of it, that civilian review board component, because I think it's just a way of holding police departments accountable to the community that they serve. Now, I want to give some credit to the Attorney General in New Jersey. He has allowed for a detective from a separate police department to investigate a police department in a different town or county that has had a deadly use of force encounter, and to investigate what happened there to see if there's any wrongdoing. The only thing is that that's not a legal binding change, meaning that the Attorney General, the next one after this one, can change it back so that there is no independent oversight from a separate detective in a separate police department. So I think that this Democratic bill does really get this right. Now, if I lost you anywhere, there is a fact sheet summary right here that you can see. It's the Democratic Justice and Policing Act summary. And I did highlight in yellow the differences that I noticed in both bills. And in green are commonalities, and in blue are things that I thought were somewhat similar, but different enough that I didn't want to consider them the same. So pretty much I talked about the things in blue and green, and the things in yellow are the differences, and the things that are going to be really tough to negotiate in the final police reform bill. And I want to talk about this one in particular. It's the holding police accountable in court. Now, this is a big one because it's what a lot of police unions are against, and what a lot of Republicans have already said, that it's a non-starter in negotiations, that we don't want this. So in order to understand this one, you need to understand what qualified immunity is. And in essence, it's a legal protection for government officials, including police officers, against civil lawsuits, meaning that if I felt my constitutional rights were violated, qualified immunity prevents me from suing this officer so long as the officer can prove that they used reasonable force. And reasonable is a very hard thing to disprove, right? So what this bill would set out to do is change that standard from reasonable to when necessary. And that's the simplification, but just hear me out. In the courtroom, it's much easier to prove that an officer used reasonable force than when using force when necessary. So police departments and police unions are naturally going to be against this because If it's much more easier for me to sue a police officer, it's going to be likely that more cases are going to be won against them. And if more cases are won against them, legal fees add up. And then the departments have to pay for this because officers individually aren't paying for these legal fees. And it incentivizes police officers from not being as violent or not using as much excessive force than needed. Now, I'm not here saying that officers need to be restrained when someone's resisting arrest, because yes, there are situations where people are resisting arrest that definitely shouldn't be resisting arrest. I just think that on a micro level, it can help with the use of excessive force. Now, the state of California has tried to change qualified immunity, and what ended up happening was a watered down bill. It wasn't as strong as it started, but there was some type of reform in it. So I can see a police reform bill negotiated by both the Republicans and the Democrats maybe touching upon this. It's a really hot potato in that the Republicans really don't want to do this and the Democrats want this. So it's going to be a tough negotiation to get this in. I can see a watered down qualified immunity reform passing, and I'll leave the link to the California Assembly Bill 392 in the description below for you to check out. Okay, so that's a breakdown of both bills. Now, ironically, the defunding the police, that's not really happening. Instead, billions of dollars are being distributed to police departments. My concern with defund the police is that some politicians, some cities see this as an opportunity to cut funding from police departments, and they don't do anything else to address public safety. And police departments rely more on ticketing and complaints, and we know how that impacts minority communities. What I want to see more of is co-responder programs where if 911 is called, a armed police officer doesn't automatically have to be involved in that civilian interaction. Now, both bills didn't really mention co-responder programs in them, and that's what I really want to see more. I want to see more police departments working with social workers, homeless outreach workers, mental health counselors to respond to non-hazardous situations. From an economic perspective, co-responder programs can limit the amount of police officers needed on the streets or in response to calls. Therefore, the budget for police departments don't need to constantly increase every single year. And I can see defund the police in terms of these other public safety programs. Now, I can see a situation like Camden where the police department was egregiously bad and they decided to just abolish them or just shut them down and then set up another police department in their place. I can see situations where that is realistic in some towns where accountability, where distrust is just so high that there is no other alternative. But it's not the same in every single town, and it's not the same to say if it works in one town, it's going to work in every town or every city. Now, the Democratic bill in the House did pass. They got the simple majority vote. However, Scott's bill in the Senate did not meet the threshold. It was, I believe, a 55 to 45 vote, meaning that it didn't reach that 60 vote threshold. Now, unless Mitch McConnell has some life-changing event where he changes his mind and says we're going to vote on a Democratic bill, pretty much the Democratic bill that was just passed is dead because it's not going to be voted on in the Senate. So now it seems like we're like in a standstill where both parties don't want to negotiate with each other and they want to accuse the other party of trying to campaign on police reform and saying that one is just trying to win on the issue and kind of campaign on it for 2020. So I don't know what's going to happen because let's say it doesn't go anywhere. Let's say police reform doesn't happen. Then we're going to have more protests. And we're in the middle of a pandemic. And that's the last thing that we need right now. So my hope is that they negotiate things out in July and kind of get a lot of the things in the Democratic bill onto Scott's bill, which is actually honestly just a baseline of what police reform looks like. And eventually it does pass.